Hi everybody, this is the lecture to accompany Chapter 5 in your textbook. Please read Chapter 5. There's a lot of information and some really good examples of fallacies of relevance that I don't have time to address in this lecture. Okay, let's get started on understanding fallacies. There is persuasion all around us, on television, in advertising, in politics, and between individuals. Those arguments are sometimes good ones. Sadly, though, a large percentage of them are fallacious. What is a logical fallacy? It's an argument that contains a mistake somewhere in the reasoning process. Lots of arguments that sound good on the surface actually contain fallacies. Many of the arguments you've used to form some of your opinions probably contain fallacies, but you didn't realize it. They sounded good, so you agreed with them. These next chapters are going to be eye-opening for you, but the more you know about how people twist logic to suit their own purposes, the better consumer of news and information you're going to be. There are two types of fallacies: fallacies of relevance and fallacies of insufficient evidence. This chapter deals solely with fallacies of relevance. These are mistakes in reasoning that occur because the premises are logically irrelevant to the conclusion. So what is relevance? A statement is relevant to another statement if it would, if true, provide at least some evidence that the second statement is true. Relevance and truth are totally separate from each other. Two statements can be relevant to each other whether they are true or not. So a fallacy of relevance occurs when the premises of an argument provide no evidence to support a conclusion. Look at this blatant example. The earth revolves around the sun. Therefore, we should support gun control legislation. It's silly because the premise doesn't support the conclusion in any way. There are three ways in which statements can be relevant or irrelevant to one another: positive relevance, negative relevance, and logical irrelevance. In positive relevance, the premises provide at least some evidence that the conclusion is true. In this example, all dogs have 5 legs and Rover is a dog, so Rover has 5 legs. The premises are relevant to the conclusion because they provide evidence to accept the conclusion. In negative relevance, the premises provide evidence that the conclusion is false. X has negative relevance to Y if X provides evidence that Y is false. Here's the example. Marty is a high school senior, so Marty has a PhD. The premise that Marty is a high school senior leads to the falseness of the conclusion that Marty has a PhD. Then there is logical irrelevance, in which the premise and the conclusion really have nothing to do with each other. The first example, the sky is blue, so the next pope will be from France. The sky being blue has nothing to do with the pope. And even though, in the second example, you might think that your dreams come true, dreaming about the Yankees winning the pennant really has nothing to do with whether the Yankees win or not. So it's logically irrelevant. So fallacies of relevance occur when the arguer offers reasons, premises, that are somehow logically irrelevant to the conclusion. We're going to look at some of the most common fallacies of relevance. They're listed here, but I'm going to go over each of them individually. You might be surprised to find that fallacies often sound like pretty good arguments. You may have used some of them yourself when you're arguing. Why? Because they often work. Most of the time, people who use them are simply ignorant about their incorrect nature, and they work, so they keep using them. But a good critical thinker who learns about fallacies has an ethical responsibility not to use them and to either discount them, ignore them, or maybe even point them out so that others are not fooled by them. So let's look at each of these in turn. Personal attack, or ad hominem, is a very common fallacy. It occurs when someone dismisses someone else's argument, not on the basis of whether or not the argument itself is flawed, but simply on the basis that there is something about that person that is flawed, therefore their argument is faulty. Here are some examples. The first one says, Tony wants us to believe that churches should be taxed. Tony is a godless SOB who has spent more time in jail than in church, so the only information we should consider from him is the best way to make license plates. It's actually kind of funny, but whether Tony is an ex-convict or not really has nothing to do with his claim that churches should be taxed. This person is focusing on Tony's character and using that as evidence that his claim is wrong. Here's another example. The governor says he won't raise taxes, but I heard he cheated on his wife. I don't trust anything he says. You've probably heard similar things in practically every election season, but look at this. What this person is really saying is that the governor cheated on his wife, therefore he's going to raise taxes. Now, does that make sense? Those two things are not connected, so this argument is fallacious. The general pattern for this fallacy is X is a bad person or did something bad. Therefore, X's argument is faulty and should be dismissed. Does this mean that a person's morals and ethics are never evidence for any argument? Of course not. Personal criticisms are not fallacious when they appear in arguments where the conclusion actually has something to do with the character of the person. In this first example, millions of innocent people died in Stalin's ruthless ideological purges. Clearly, Stalin was one of the most brutal dictators of the 20th century. The arguer is referring to Stalin as a brutal dictator, but they use good evidence to come to that conclusion. In the second example, it's important we elect a governor with high moral standards. Governor Smith has been caught cheating on his wife. Let's vote him out of office. The arguer is saying here that the governor should have high moral standards, and because Governor Smith has cheated on his wife, he doesn't fit that standard and should be voted out of office. Now, this is a much better argument than the cheating governor example above, because this one is actually about character. So, if the argument is actually about character, then you can use the goodness or badness of a person as evidence. But if it's about something else, then you can't, and the argument is fallacious. Attacking the motive is similar to ad hominem because in it you're criticizing a person's motive for making a particular claim instead of looking at their evidence for that claim. In this first example, Professor Michelson has argued in favor of tenure, but of course he does. He's a tenured professor. What this person is saying is that because the professor has tenure, he's biased towards tenure, and his argument should then be rejected. This is the common pattern of this fallacy. X is biased or has questionable motives, therefore X's argument or claim should be rejected. This is similar to ad hominem in that the person dismissing the argument is doing it simply because they distrust the motive of the person putting forth the argument, not looking at the evidence for the person's claim at all. The fact that someone might benefit from a conclusion's truth does not mean that their argument isn't a good one and should be rejected. While motivation isn't a good reason to automatically reject someone's argument, you should look to see if that person is motivated to misrepresent the facts. In this example, Bob said there is no scientific evidence that smoking can cause cancer, but Bob is a spokesperson for the tobacco corporations, so you shouldn't believe that there is no such evidence just because he says there isn't. So Bob is paid by the tobacco industry to say smoking doesn't cause cancer, so you should at least be skeptical about any facts that he puts forth. Here's a fallacy you've probably used yourself, maybe on your parents. The look who's talking or tu quoque fallacy occurs when we reject another person's argument because they failed to practice what they preach. In this example, my dad smoked pot in high school. He has no business telling me I can't do it. The teenager argues that because his dad smoked pot in high school, that his argument against his son doing it should be rejected. The common pattern here is X fails to follow his or her own advice, therefore X's argument should be rejected. Now, this sounds pretty good, but here's the issue. An argument is good or bad because of its own intrinsic strengths or weaknesses, not because of who offers it up. Just because the dad smoked pot as a teen, that doesn't mean he doesn't have good reasons for not wanting his son to follow in his footsteps. Now, of course, this is not to say that hypocrisy is okay. Obviously, it's a bit hypocritical to say someone shouldn't smoke pot if you did. And it's okay to point that out. Here's an example. My neighbor gave me a hard time when I was washing my car in the driveway, saying there's a drought and we should conserve water. I agree, but he really should follow his own advice and not water his plants in the middle of the day. So the person is not rejecting the other person's argument, they're just calling him out on his hypocrisy. Two wrongs make a right. This fallacy is related to the last one. In two wrongs make a right, you argue that because someone else did something, you can do it too. Or maybe they did something worse, so your action is not as bad by comparison. In this fallacy, we attempt to justify our actions by using other people's actions as an excuse. Nevertheless, unless you're a sociopath, you probably have a basic understanding of right and wrong. So you can compare and justify all day, but you still know that what you did doesn't quite fit ethical standards, or you wouldn't have to justify it. This example, it's okay to drive up to 10 miles over the speed limit. I haven't seen a single person on the road today that was driving the speed limit. That doesn't make driving 10 miles over the speed limit justified. Or the Simpson example, Marge says, "Bart, stop hitting your sister," and Bart says, "Well, she pinched me." So the common forms of this are X is common behavior, therefore X is not wrong. Or X is worse than Y, therefore Y is not wrong. Now, there are times when your actions that might under other circumstances be wrong are justified because they are a response to other actions. So I shot the man because he was about to kill me. It was an act of self-defense. If you shoot a person, that's generally a bad thing. However, if you shoot him because he was trying to kill you, then that's justified and it really doesn't fall under this fallacy. Scare tactics. While fear is probably the most powerful motivator, the use of scare tactics in arguments is fallacious and often unethical. When an arguer threatens harm, physical or non-physical, to their audience if they don't accept their conclusion, and the harm has nothing to do with whether the conclusion is true or not, that's a fallacy. So here's an example. This gun control bill is wrong for America, and any politician who supports it will discover how wrong he or she is at the election. So whoever's making this argument is threatening legislators that if they don't reject a gun control law, they will be voted out of office. The person making this argument could certainly make good on that threat. So even if a legislator truly believes that there are good reasons for supporting the gun control law, they may take the threat seriously and vote against it. Unfortunately, the person making the threat doesn't need to have any evidence to support their argument, just the threat. "I'm going to have you voted out of office" does not support the conclusion the gun control bill is wrong for America. It's irrelevant and therefore fallacious. Sometimes arguments that have a threat in them are not fallacious. If the natural consequences of doing a thing are harmful, then they are relevant to the truth of the conclusion. So you shouldn't blow dry your hair in the bathtub, you'll get electrocuted. Obviously, the threat of electrocution is the natural outcome of blow drying your hair in the bathtub, and this is not fallacious. An appeal to pity. You know, sometimes pity and compassion is well-deserved. However, many arguments try to use these emotions inappropriately to sway their audience to accept their conclusions. If the emotion is not evidence that the conclusion should be accepted, then the argument is fallacious. In the first example, he deserves to start on the football team. If he doesn't, he will be really upset. Well, frankly, the fact that he'll be upset if he doesn't play is not a good reason to give someone a starting position on a football team. I've heard this second example before many times. "You shouldn't give me an F in the class just because I failed all the exams. I had a really rough semester." Sure, I do have compassion for you, but that's not good enough evidence to come to the conclusion that you shouldn't get an F. But of course, there are times when emotional appeal is good evidence to come to a conclusion. In this example, Mom's been feeling depressed. You should visit her today. Mom's feelings are a legitimate reason to go see her. So when you see emotional appeals like this in arguments, check to make sure the emotion is a good reason to accept the conclusion. If it's not, it's a fallacy. The bandwagon fallacy plays on the popularity of something and uses that as evidence that a conclusion should be accepted. It plays on a person's desire to be popular, accepted, or valued. However, popularity is irrelevant as to whether a conclusion is true or not. You may have even said this first example to your mom at some point. But Mom, everyone is wearing that brand of jeans. I have to have them. You have to buy them for me. The teenager is saying that because everyone else wears a particular brand of jeans, then she has to also. Of course, my mom would come back with something like, oh, really? If everyone jumped off a cliff, would you jump too? You know, I probably would have when I was 16. But it's not just teens who fall for the bandwagon fallacy. Otherwise, perfectly intelligent adults do too. The second example, there must be something to astrology. Millions of people believe in it. Just because millions of people believe something, that doesn't make it true. Now, if you're going to prove that something's true, you'll have to have better evidence than lots of people think so. Now, sometimes an argument that uses lots of people think so as evidence isn't fallacious. If you believe that the people who say so actually know what they're talking about and it's not about what's popular, then that might be good evidence to believe something. So all the villagers say it's safe to drink the water, so it's probably safe to drink. Since those people obviously drink the water, and they're not dead, you can probably drink the water too. In a straw man argument, the attacker distorts an opponent's argument to make it seem simple or weak, and thus easier to attack. Here's the first example. Senator Biddle argued that we should outlaw violent pornography. Obviously, he is against free speech, and he favors complete governmental censorship of books, magazines, and films. This runs counter to everything this great nation stands for. No one should take him seriously. The person arguing against Senator Biddle distorts the claim that violent pornography should be outlawed to say is against all free speech, which is not exactly what he said. But once you say someone is against free speech, it's easier to attack that claim. The second argument is much the same. Proponents of sex education just want to give kids license to have sex with no consequences. The arguer is equating sex education with kids having sex with no consequences, which is not the same thing. But once you put an image in parents' minds of their kids running around having sex with everyone and everything, it's easy to argue against that happening. It's fallacious because it's not the argument that was intended. It's something else, which is irrelevant to the original argument. It usually comes in this pattern. The attacker of the argument misrepresents the original claim. Then they say that their interpretation of that conclusion is false. Then the conclusion is that the person's argument should be rejected. So be very careful when looking at arguments that attack another's argument. Make sure the original argument is being framed properly. If it's not, it's fallacious. The term red herring comes from a technique used to train English foxhounds. A very smelly fish, a herring, was used to distract foxhounds from following the scent of the fox. The trainers were attempting to train the hounds to ignore the overwhelming scent of the fish and stick to following the fox's scent. A good hound was one that could ignore the distraction and focus on the original fox scent. Most of us aren't that good when it comes to avoiding being distracted by irrelevant information, though. An arguer commits the red herring fallacy when he or she tries to sidetrack the audience by throwing irrelevant information into the argument and pretending that it proves the point being made. Many people criticize Jefferson for owning slaves, but he was one of our greatest presidents. Such criticisms must be unfounded. While it's certainly true that Jefferson is considered to be a great president, that's irrelevant to the question of whether or not criticisms of him for owning slaves are unfounded. The second one, it's not gun control we need, it's better treatment for the mentally ill. Unless something is done to get mental illness in check, we will never be free from these terrible killing sprees. Again, it's true that our country could use better treatment for the mentally ill. Nevertheless, that's a distraction from the original argument, and it's irrelevant to the issue of whether or not we need more gun control. The problem with red herrings is that they usually sound pretty good. And because we often say, yes, that's true, to the distracting claim, even though it's irrelevant to the argument being made. When you look at arguments, make sure the premises lead to the conclusions and don't lead you in a different direction. The fallacy of equivocation has to do with the meanings of words. Remember, words are often ambiguous. The fallacy of equivocation occurs when someone switches the meaning of one or more of its ambiguous terms, and the incorrect meaning is irrelevant to the argument. Here's one that should be familiar to you. Critical thinking helps you to argue better. But do we really need to encourage people to argue? There's enough hostility in the world as it is. Obviously, the word argue has two different meanings that we've already discussed in class. The first, argue, is the formal meaning of argument in philosophy. The second, argue, is the common meaning of argument, as in a disagreement. You can avoid being guilty of this fallacy by using language carefully and defining important terms when necessary. The last kind of fallacy of relevance we will discuss is called begging the question. This happens when the arguer states as a premise the very thing they're arguing for as the conclusion. There are two common ways this fallacy is committed. The first way is to restate the premise as the conclusion, as in this example. Bungee jumping is dangerous because it's unsafe. Obviously, dangerous and unsafe mean the same thing. If you said bungee jumping is dangerous because it's dangerous, what kind of argument is that? Not a very good one. The second type of begging the question is called circular reasoning, and basically, at least one of the premises is the same as the conclusion, even though there may be any number of premises in the argument. Here's an example. God wrote the Bible because it said so in the Bible, and what the Bible says is true because it was written by God. That's circular reasoning. These can get very complex, but look for repetition in the premises and again in the conclusion. If an arguer is asking you to accept a premise that is the same thing as the conclusion, you're dealing with begging the question. So in this chapter, we've looked at fallacies of relevance. Remember that they are fallacies because the evidence or reasons are somehow irrelevant to the conclusion. Let's quickly review them. Personal attack or ad hominem uses a character attack as evidence when that evidence is not relevant to the topic at hand. Attacking the motive says that because someone might have a particular motive for their argument, that argument should be discounted, even though their motive, if they have one, is not relevant to the argument. Look Who's Talking, or tu quoque, says that someone's argument should be discounted because they do the very thing that they're arguing against, which is hypocrisy. But what this person does is not really relevant to whether or not their argument is a good one. Two wrongs make a right happens when you say that what you have done, although bad, is equally bad or not as bad as what someone else has done and therefore somehow okay. Scare tactics are threats that someone should accept the conclusion of your argument or else something bad will happen, which is irrelevant to whether the argument is good or bad. Appeal to pity says that pity or compassion is good evidence that a conclusion is correct, even if it really has nothing to do with the argument. Bandwagon is the appeal to popularity, saying that because lots of people like or do something, that is the correct thing to like or do. Straw man attempts to diminish the claims of another person by misrepresenting them to make them appear weaker or foolish, and therefore making them easier to argue against. Red herring is an attempt to distract from the original argument by raising an irrelevant issue and pretending that the matter is settled because of that. Equivocation is conflating two different meanings for the same word when one of those meanings is not relevant to the topic at hand. Begging the question happens when an arguer uses as evidence the very thing that they're attempting to prove as the conclusion. This is the end of the lecture to accompany Chapter 5.